Our presentation looks at medieval anchorites, contemporary performance artists, and the refugees and host churches who made up the 1980s sanctuary movement as examples of performing sanctuary. While these performances are by no means directly analogous, we argue that there are useful resonances when they are read together. In all three cases, a person's embodied presence incarnates and grounds a sanctuary, as opposed to viewing them as merely inhabiting an already sanctified space. Sanctuary is created in the relationships around a welcoming and sheltering space. Those who are sheltered are truly as essential to performing sanctuary as those who open up the space. In particular, emphasizing the similarities the refugees share with anchorites and performance artists reframes their participation in the sanctuary movement as a generative practice that anchors their spiritual community. When we bring in anchorites and performance artists as possible repertoires to use when deploying sanctuary, we better see how refugees actively participate in creating sanctuary instead of passively accepting it. Centering sanctuary practices as flowing from the refugees instead of the churches sheltering them shifts our perspective from a dynamic of being rescued to the relational dynamics of mutual transformation. In the time we have, Kiki will discuss medieval anchorites, contemporary performance art, and our project Anklehold, which brought both together. Nathan, me, will then extend the insights from her experience towards a consideration of how we can better imagine the 1980s sanctuary movement.
Do I touch the one right here? Yeah, okay. Oh, thanks. All right, so anchorites take religious vows of permanent seclusion. And in the Middle Ages, these people... Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? All right. So, anchorites take religious vows of permanent seclusion. In the Middle Ages, these people lived in anchor holds, from a Greek word meaning to withdraw or retire from society. Ritually enclosed in rooms commonly attached to churches, they were devoted to prayer, the Eucharist, and offering spiritual guidance to locals and pilgrims. According to the 13th century guide for female recluses, the Anchoran Rule, the anchoress anchors the church and holds it so the waves and storms do not capsize it. Holy Church anchors on the anchoress, for her to hold it so the devil's blasts and temptations do not blow it over. This is her lifelong commitment. Anchoresses performed sanctuary not by offering physical shelter, but by inhabiting sacred spaces in ways that spiritually grounded and stabilized their communities. In the 14th century, a mystic called Julian had a series of visions and wrote Revelations of Divine Love, the earliest known English language text by a woman. For several decades, she lived in an anchor hold, right here, attached to St. Julian's Church in Norwich, England. After the church was destroyed in World War II, it was rebuilt on the original foundations. And this is the door to her original enclosure, reconstructed. So the Anchorhold project was an art installation located in a crypt where visitors were invited to explore contemplative spiritual practices. It was inspired by Julian's mystical experiences and writings. I wanted to trace a relationship between my then home in Washington, D.C., and Julian's medieval Norwich in England, so I cited the project in Washington, D.C.'s National Cathedral, which is built in a 14th century English Gothic style. In the crypt, the Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage hosted the project in the space between St. Dunstan's Chapel and their library. We constructed an 8-foot square cell lined with raw linen panels, and following instructions from the Anchoran Rule, we sewed a white cross on a black window curtain to signify death to the world. The 3-part installation echoed the 3 windows of an anchor hold, one opening to the church for worship, one to the community for guidance, and one to a maid for sustenance and survival. For 7 days, I remained on site, reading aloud and making drawings in response to Julian's text. Like a servant to an anchoress, I performed domestic labor, dusting, sweeping, hosting visitors, while protecting the seclusion of individuals inside the cell. I performed sanctuary through my intentional presence in the installation. The center's director offered public workshops on poetry and embodied spirituality. Some visitors walked into the enclosure and right back out. Others lingered, and I could hear them writing or murmuring behind the curtain. Families brought their children to draw and play with finger labyrinths, and small groups of people gathered in the communal area to talk about their experiences. Over time, the installation developed into a collaborative project. Cathedral staff contributed to a communal audio recording of Julian's short text. A local medievalist and librarian wrote a guide to Julian's works, and a teacher led sacred dances in Julian's memory. By imagining a contemporary anchorhold as a space for hospitality, this project made visible some ways anchorites remained connected to their communities while living in seclusion. The enclosure was, in Sarah Law's words, the still center of the local turning world that facilitated a deepening of connection and spiritual wellness. In choosing to take vows and enter the religious life of an anchoress, Julian committed to performing its daily rites, liturgical and private devotion, and meditation. She also had time to contemplate her visions and write a longer, more complete version of Revelations of Divine Love. Her anchorhold became both a domestic space and a site for creative labor, a medieval room of her own where she could write freely. In the Middle Ages, women's public claims to direct experience of God could be dangerous. Marguerite Porete, a 13th century mystic, was buried at the stake for her unconventional writings. The walls that enclosed Julian's body also protected her words, which come down to us today, and she is now lauded as one of England's most important mystics. Her book became a portal for me, a way to envision her mystical experiences. I practiced Lectio Divina using a 1942 edition of a reprinting of Grace Warwick's 1901 translation of the long text. In this artist book, I made drawings of lilies and wounds and a series of collages combining female bodies and domestic architecture, a theme that has been plumbed by a number of artists, including Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro in their feminist installation Woman House, Laurie Simons in her photograph Walking House, and Louise Bourgeois in her sculpture Femme Maison. In the 14th Revelation, I collaged a hot pink anchorhold on top of pale yellow medieval stockings. The image inhabits the text, and the words create an enclosure on the page. Julian of Norwich described her experience of God with metaphors drawn from daily life: fish scales, hazelnuts, and blood. Her mystical insights also emerged through action in her bodily visions. To explore the physicality of her text, I created Consumed, a live performance that draws on the medieval European Christian practice of eating holy text. In this era, according to curator Elizabeth Sandoval, people believed that words, written and read, spoken and heard, could imprint on the brain, heart, and soul. Alone in the anchorhold, I read aloud from Revelations of Divine Love and copied lines of text onto paper. Combining the actions of manuscript making with devotional gestures, I dusted the letters with gold powder and smoothed them with a bone folder, repeatedly expanding my interaction with the text to my other senses, smelling, licking, chewing, and swallowing the words for spiritual nourishment. Consumed transforms Julian's written revelations into physical experience, giving flesh to her insights through materials, my body, space, and time. Rather than engaging her ideas through rational thinking alone, a durational performance makes them visceral, something that can be touched, witnessed, and felt. Through repeated actions that unfold over time, attention is honed and meaning is allowed to emerge from embodied memories and accumulated touch. Oops. Reading is often imagined as a purely intellectual activity, but it has special physical dimensions: paper and ink, hands turning pages, eyes that take in sight, and light. By making the consumption of the text literal and embodied, it emphasized the theological implication that we read with both our minds and our bodies because we are both matter and spirit. The Anchorhold Project brought medieval enclosure practices into conversation with contemporary performance art. Tsing's one-year performance and Camacho's Enclose explored bodily confinement through isolation and endurance. While Anchorhold similarly engaged bodily enclosure, it differed by emphasizing connection rather than isolation. In Embassy of the Refugee, Rollo and Duarte collaborated with activists to build, in quotes, an interactive contemporary sculpture that, as a pseudo-state institution, symbolically creates an autonomous space of refuge and creativity, and tests how the arts might assume the role of state authorities and governmental institutions by fostering understanding, empathy, and the idea of communal self-determination. The Anchorhold Project shares this piece's concerns of community witness, mutual encounter and reframing enclosure as a collaborative and relational rather than withdrawing from the world. However, where the Embassy of the Refugee pursued political aims, the Anchorhold project centered on spiritual ones. These are people from the who were involved in the Embassy of the Refugee.
During the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, nearly 500 houses of worship across the United States publicly declared themselves sanctuaries for unsanctioned refugees fleeing Central America. Their actions were, as one historian puts it, the largest mass mobilization of civil disobedience against detention and deportation in U.S. history. Participating congregations crafted performances that displayed their opposition to the Reagan administration's Central American policies and their commitment to refugees. When Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona became one of the first U.S. congregations to publicly declare sanctuary, they formally welcomed a Salvadoran man with the pseudonym Alfredo and his family to shelter in their church building in front of both their congregation and 40-some reporters that they had invited. Activists made the case that Alfredo's family, like others fleeing violence in Central America, were legitimate asylum seekers with a credible fear of persecution who needed to be recognized under international and federal law. And the Reagan State Department was politicizing asylum approvals to dismiss refugees who had escaped from US-backed regimes. The movement argued that their civil disobedience in harboring and transporting so-called illegal immigrants recognized both the more correct interpretation of civil law and the even higher standard of divine law. Churches participating in the sanctuary movement used performances like these to purposely draw attention to the fact that they were taking in refugees and openly flaunting immigration enforcement. That was part of their strategy. Jim Corbett, a coyote or smuggler who guided refugees to Tucson, and one of Sanctuary's more public spokespeople, said that keeping the operation clandestine was exactly what the government wanted us to do, keeping it hidden, keeping the issue out of public view. The sanctuary movement dared the government to raid their churches and risk negative publicity and moral questioning that crossing that line would entail. There was no legal basis that prevented INS from entering churches. It was simply the performance of sanctuary that intimidated the federal government into an official policy of not actively enforcing at sensitive locations like churches, schools, and hospitals. These performative uses of a sacred space gave the sanctuary movement room to operate in. Declarations of sanctuary were bolstered by an intentionally invented sacred tradition of sanctuary that linked several different concepts through a single historical imagination. These historical precedents allowed sanctuary advocates to argue that, in the words of New York Rabbi Balfour Brickner, sanctuary is an historic and hallowed principle in religious life. Advocates for sanctuary point to the Bible, most often the Mosaic Law stipulations for cities of refuge, and the Gospel of Matthew's account of Jesus' family fleeing to Egypt to escape a first-century death squad. When Sojourners asked Corbett when the sanctuary movement started, he slyly answered that you'll have to consult Exodus on that. It's very important to realize that the sanctuary movement is not something that somewhere suddenly invented. He said, it has been around better than 3,000 years. Activists in the sanctuary movement also pointed to more recent historical examples. They contrasted the Christians who helped organize the Underground Railroad with those who had stood by during the Holocaust as positive and negative examples of why it was critical for their churches to intervene and take in refugees. Despite its real success at preventing deportation and saving lives, the sanctuary movement still made unforced errors, especially in how activists from the US interacted with refugee members of the movement. Pastor and activist Michael Wolf's monograph Sanctuary and Solidarity drew my attention to how churches that offered sanctuary often unintentionally created relationships where they lacked accountability to the people they offered sanctuary to. Even that phrasing, people they offered sanctuary to, creates and reinforces a narrative where US churches are the sole actors, who provide sanctuary to refugees as a generous surplus. When these churches talked about their obligations towards the sanctuary movement, it was often in the language of their biblical injunctions to welcome the stranger and love the neighbor, as a general commitment to refugees, not quite so much as consideration of how the movement was specifically accountable to particular individuals. As Wolf explains, this left white activists largely in control of deciding the shape of sanctuary practice. The sanctuary movement featured a near complete absence of recipients from formal leadership roles within the movement, which led to an extremely reduced and distorted view of agency of recipients as they occupied the role of victim, and power dynamic imbalances that sometimes resulted in undesirable outcomes for both activists and recipients. Since American churches held the physical resources and the legal status that made up the sanctuary movement's capital, it was easy for them to view decisions about what risks to assume and what resources to expend as decisions for their congregations to make that were then communicated to refugees. These tremendously material power hierarchies, who owns the building, did not vanish away at will, however much white American participants in the movement wanted to believe that they had. While the decentralized organization of the sanctuary movement was a successful tactical approach, it also allowed task forces to assume that refugee input was already happening, either informally or through a consensus process at the local level. Such power obliviousness, Wolf writes, did not reflect reality. Refugees were not empowered to navigate or question these power dynamics, and this created conflict when participants in the sanctuary movements butted up against them. In some of the worst cases, churches were telling refugees when they could or couldn't take showers in the church building. One church decided that having the refugees sheltering with them sign a legal contract would help clarify everyone's expectations. But when this refugee attended a national conference of sanctuary activists, he felt justifiably insulted when he learned that other refugees had been offered sanctuary without having to sign a contract that allowed their churches to evict them at basically any time. People in sanctuary had to struggle for agency in a movement that had pragmatic reasons for framing them as passive victims of violence and passive recipients of aid. Their standard activity in the movement was performing testimonials that conveyed what they had suffered to different church groups across the country. This was an important and impactful contribution. Performing as a legible and recognizable victim bolstered the sanctuary movement's essential argument that Central Americans had legitimate fears of persecution and needed to stay in the United States. But and this world's mix of passive Christ-like suffering and utter destitution compelled Christians in the United States to step up and help. But it also meant the refugees who gave testimonials had to relive their own trauma and present, for their own safety, as a depersonalized, instrumentalized avatar of sheer suffering. Performing as a refugee in the theater of sanctuary was a psychological burden that largely went unacknowledged at the time. There were times when I felt that the more I cried, the better it was because people felt sorry and they would donate money to our sanctuary, one refugee reported. They just wanted me to present as a victim. Taking on this role prevented refugees from being fully recognized as activists in their own right, even when their activism in El Salvador or Guatemala was often why they had to seek sanctuary. Refugees often grew frustrated with the limitations that the movement's strategies placed on their own urgency to act. Francisco, taking sanctuary in New Jersey, believed that refugees were not listened to within the movement because Americans feared too much outspokenness shown by some refugees at raising the problems of our country, and because of the narrowness that exists in some sanctuary churches, believing that refugees only should limit themselves to their own testimony. Another Guatemalan refugee sheltering in Dayton, Ohio, reported that she had not come to your country to sit on my hands. The churches that participated in the sanctuary movement in the 1980s did an incredible job of constructing a usable sacred tradition that justified their use of sanctuary and performing it to protect refugees from La Migra. Their insistence that the moral values needed to be incarnated through relationships with refugees was fundamentally correct. What we want to consider is how their imagination and the imaginations of activists today could be expanded to avoid the pitfalls and power dynamics that too often hamper the movement's attempts to move from charity to mutual liberation. To that end, we ask how our collective moral imaginations will expand by weaving anchorites and performance artists into that invented tradition of sanctuary and its contemporary performances. What would happen if churches interacted with individuals in sanctuary more like an artist in residence? How would affirming that refugees were the anchors spiritually grounding the churches they sheltered in change their involvement in the local community and the movement overall? What if sanctuary was seen more clearly, not as a quality or a resource that churches already possessed and provided to refugees, but rather as a collective performance catalyzed by the person offering themselves as an inhabitant who sacralizes the space? We can rattle off a list of practices for including refugees in the sanctuary movement and supporting their agency. But fleshing out how we imagine sanctuary being created and how we perform it could put that acknowledgement into our bodies and hearts. The way that anchorites and performance artists practice inhabiting space can help us start to imagine a role where those who seek the church's aid and shelter have increased agency in that performance. Today, the utter shamelessness of United States current immigration enforcement officials means that sanctuary does not offer the same security now as it did 40 years ago. Still, we hope that asking these questions now can help us in our own work as artists, scholars, or people of faith to perform sanctuary better. Thank you.